Mark Sterling pressed his mistress against his own office door and laughed while his wife's name lit up his phone for the fourth time that morning. He didn't even glance at it. "Elena can wait," he said, kissing Jessica's neck. "She always waits. That's the only thing she's good for." He silenced the call with his thumb and never once imagined that 3 floors below a woman in a gray coat was signing the document that would take everything he owned. If you believe silence can be stronger than screaming, subscribe. Now stay with me to the very end and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Elena's story travels. Mark Sterling had a habit of talking about his wife the way other men talked about the weather, casually, dismissively, as if she were something that happened to him rather than someone he chose. On that particular Tuesday morning, he stood in the glass corner office on the 41st floor of Sterling Capital Group. And he did what he did best. He performed. He performed confidence, he performed power, and most of all, he performed the role of a man who believed he could not be touched. She called again. Jessica Hartley said, adjusting the collar of her blouse, glancing at the phone still glowing on his desk. There was amusement in her voice, but underneath it, something more careful. "4 times, Mark. Doesn't that bother you even a little?" "Nothing about Elena bothers me," he said. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, and looked out over Manhattan like a man surveying a kingdom he genuinely believed he had built alone. "You know what my wife did this morning? She made me eggs. She laid out my tie. She asked me if I wanted her to have the driver ready." He turned around grinning. 12 years of marriage and she still thinks the way to keep a man is to fold his shirts." Jessica laughed, but she was watching him the way people watch a fire that's burning a little too close to the curtains. "And the way to keep a man," she said, stepping closer, "is what exactly? To be interesting," Mark said. "To be alive. To be you." He caught her by the waist. "Elena stopped being interesting the day she decided being my wife was a full-time job." He honestly believed that. That was the thing about Mark Sterling. He wasn't lying to Jessica, and he wasn't lying to himself. He had constructed a version of Elena in his mind, a quiet, gray background woman, and he had lived inside that construction for so long that he'd forgotten it was something he'd invented. He mistook her silence for emptiness. He mistook her patience for weakness. And that mistake, though he could not know it yet, was going to cost him more than money. It was going to cost him the only life he'd ever wanted. His assistant Denise knocked once and opened the door without waiting the way she'd learned to when the news was time-sensitive. "Mr. Sterling, your wife's assistant just confirmed the dinner reservation for 8 tonight, table for 2. She said Mrs. Sterling booked it herself." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "A romantic dinner. How sweet." Mark waved a hand. "It's our anniversary. 12 years. He said it flatly, the way you'd read an expiration date off a carton of milk. "I'll show up, I'll smile, I'll give her the necklace I had someone pick out, and I'll be back in the city by 10. He looked at Jessica. "Your place or mine?" "Yours," she said. "Elena won't be home." "Elena," he said, "is exactly where I need her to be. Home, quiet, grateful." He picked up his phone finally and read the missed calls, and the 2 words underneath them made his mouth twitch with irritation rather than concern. "Call me," he read aloud. "That's it. That's what 4 calls were about. Call me." He tossed the phone back onto the desk. "You see what I live with, eh?" What Mark did not know could not know because he had never once bothered to look past the surface of the woman he'd married was that Elena Sterling had not spent that morning making eggs and folding shirts. She had spent it in a leather chair in a downtown office across a wide table from a silver-haired man named Howard Briggs, signing her name at the bottom of a stack of documents so thick it had taken 20 minutes just to date them all. "You're absolutely certain?" Howard had asked her, sliding the last page across. "Once these are filed, Elena, there's no soft landing, no quiet reconciliation. This is a door that only opens one direction." "I stopped wanting a soft landing 2 years ago," Elena said. Her voice was calm, even almost gentle. That was the thing people always got wrong about her. They expected fury to sound loud. Hers sounded like a woman ordering coffee. "The morning I found the second phone." 2 years, Howard repeated, and even he, a man who had seen the ugliest ends of 1,000 marriages, looked at her with something close to awe. You've known for 2 years, and you never said a word." "I said plenty of words," Elena said. She signed the final page and set down the pen with a click that sounded in that quiet office like a lock turning. "I just didn't waste any of them on Mark." Back on the 41st floor, Mark Sterling was doing what powerful men do when they feel completely safe. He was getting careless. He kissed Jessica goodbye in the open doorway of his office, in full view of the assistants and analysts moving through the corridor, in full view of the security cameras he himself had installed, in full view of a young analyst named Peter Cho, who happened to be walking past with a stack of quarterly reports, and who happened, in that exact moment, to be on the phone with someone in the compliance department. Peter slowed. He didn't mean to. His eyes went to the doorway, then to the floor, then to the phone at his ear, and he mumbled, I'll call you back, and kept walking. But he'd seen it, and in a company where the walls were made of glass and the loyalties were made of paper, seeing something was never the end of it. It was the beginning. Mark noticed none of this. He went back to his desk, poured himself a coffee, and called his broker about a deal that would, he was certain, add another $250 million to a fortune he already believed was untouchable. He talked for 40 minutes about leverage and timing and confidence. He used the word empire twice. And the entire time in a filing office 9 blocks south, a clerk stamped a date onto a petition for divorce and slid it into a system that would notify in sequence a series of people whose lives were about to intersect Mark Sterling's with the force of a train hitting a stalled car. At noon, Elena went to lunch. Not with a lawyer, not with a friend, alone. She sat at a small table by the window of a restaurant she and Mark used to go to in the early years, before the money got large enough to become the only thing they had in common, and she ordered the soup he used to order, and she thought about the woman she'd been when she married him. She had been 28. She had been in love genuinely, foolishly, completely in love with a hungry young man named Mark Sterling, who had a great smile and a good mind, and almost no money, and enormous aching ambition. What Mark had never known, what he had never once asked, was where the seed money for Sterling Capital had actually come from. He believed he'd raised it. He believed he'd charmed it out of investors and clawed it out of banks. He believed the founding capital of his empire was the product of his own genius. It was not. The founding capital had come from Elena, or rather from the trust that stood behind Elena, the Marcello Heritage Trust, an old, deep, patient body of family money that Elena had never once mentioned in 12 years, because in the beginning she had wanted Mark to love her and not the trust. And later, when she understood what kind of man he'd become, she had wanted him to never ever see the trap he was standing inside until the moment it closed. She'd structured it herself, quietly. She'd sat in on the incorporation of Sterling Capital as Mark's wife, smiling in the photographs, saying nothing during the meetings, and she had made sure through Howard, through a chain of holding entities so elegant it could have been framed, that the trust held 53% of the company that bore her husband's name. 53%, a majority. Mark ran the company. Elena owned it. And for 12 years he had walked into that building every morning believing he was the king, when in truth he was a tenant living in a house whose deed had his wife's maiden name written all over it, in ink he'd never learned to read. She finished her soup. She left a generous tip because she'd been generous her whole life and saw no reason to stop now, and she went home to their penthouse to wait not for Mark, but for the machine she had built to begin its work. At 2 p.m, Mark got the first sign that something was wrong, and characteristically, he ignored it. His card was declined at the private club where he took clients for drinks. Not the personal card, the corporate card, the one tied to a discretionary account he'd been using for years, to pay for things that had nothing to do with the company. Hotel rooms, jewelry, a weekend in the Hamptons that Elena had never taken. He stared at the little terminal at the word declined, and he laughed and told the waiter it was obviously a mistake, and he handed over a different card, and he made a mental note to yell at someone in finance. He did not wonder why. That was the thing about Mark. He never wondered why. Wondering why required a kind of humility he'd surgically removed from himself somewhere around his 3rd million. At 3, Denise came in again, and this time her face was different, careful, pale. "Mr. Sterling, there are some people from Hargrove Associates in the lobby. They're asking to leave a package with you personally. They say it has to be signed for." "Hargrove Associates," Mark said, frowning. "Who the hell is Hargrove?" They're an investigation firm, sir. An investigation firm. He set down his pen. For the first time all day, something cold moved through his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the distant cousin of it, the animal awareness that a shadow has just passed over the sun. Send them up. 2 men came up. They were polite. They were quiet. They wore the kind of gray suits designed to be forgotten. One of them, the older one, set a manila envelope on Mark's desk with the reverence of a man laying a wreath. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "you've been served." "Served," Mark repeated. "Served what?" "Have a good afternoon, sir." And they left. Just like that. They did not explain, they did not linger, they did not answer the questions that were beginning to pile up behind Mark's teeth. They simply left him alone with a manila envelope and a silence that had suddenly grown teeth. He opened it. He was smiling when he opened it because he was Mark Sterling, and Mark Sterling had never in his adult life opened an envelope that contained bad news. Bad news happened to other people. He read the first line. His smile stayed. He read the second line. His smile flickered. He read the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," and the smile fell off his face entirely and did not come back. "That's not possible," he said out loud to no one to the empty office. She didn't." He flipped pages. He saw Elena's signature clean and certain. He saw a date that morning. He saw the name of a firm he didn't recognize, Briggs Walsh and Associates, and a second name that made his stomach lurch. Catherine Walsh, a litigator whose reputation preceded her the way a storm surge precedes a hurricane. He grabbed his phone. He called Elena. It went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time and left a message, and the message was ugly, and the message was a mistake, because everything Mark said from that afternoon forward was going into a file, and he did not know it. "Elena," he snarled into the phone, "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. You'll get nothing. You hear me? You walk away with nothing. This is my company, my money, my life, and you're just the woman I let live in it. Call me back before you embarrass yourself." He hung up. His hands were shaking. He told himself it was anger. It was not entirely anger. Jessica, who had come back to the office to collect a scarf and had heard the tail end of the message through the open door, stood very still in the corridor. She was a smart woman. She was smarter than Mark, actually, which was one of the reasons he found her interesting. And her intelligence was already in real time, performing a very cold calculation. She had signed on to be the mistress of a titan. She had not signed on to be a witness in a divorce. She slipped out without her scarf. At 4 o'clock, the second envelope arrived, and this one Mark did not open at the office. This one was delivered to the penthouse, and he only learned about it because the building's concierge called up to his mobile to confirm he'd be home to receive it. "A hand-delivered letter, Mr. Sterling, marked personal, from your wife." "My wife lives there," Mark said, bewildered. "Why is she mailing me a letter to my own home?" "She checked out this afternoon, sir," the concierge said, and then realizing the strangeness of his own word choice, corrected himself. "I mean, she moved out, around 1 o'clock. 2 men with a van. She said you'd understand." Mark left the office. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He got in the back of his car, and he told the driver to take him home, and he sat in the traffic on the FDR with the divorce petition on his lap, and a growing, sickening awareness that the ground he had always assumed was solid beneath him had at some point he had failed to notice turned into water. He tried to think. He tried to organize the pieces. Elena had filed for divorce. Fine. Ugly, humiliating, but survivable. Wives filed for divorce. He had lawyers. He had money. He had a company worth billions and a reputation that opened doors on 3 continents. Even in a divorce, even in the worst divorce, a man like him did not walk away with nothing. She'd get a settlement, a big one maybe. He'd write a check with a lot of zeros on it, and he'd be free, and honestly, some part of him thought maybe free was fine. Maybe free was good. Maybe he'd been wanting free for years. Then he remembered the prenup. And for one glorious moment, he relaxed, because the prenup had been his idea. He'd insisted on it before the wedding, back when he was hungry and terrified of losing the little he had. And Elena's sweet, agreeable quiet, Elena had signed it without a single complaint. He'd read it 100 times. It protected him. It walled off his assets. It capped what she could claim. He'd built a fortress and made her sign a promise not to storm it. He pulled the petition back into his lap and with fumbling fingers found the section that referenced the prenuptial agreement. And there in the flat, merciless language of the law was the sentence that turned the cold in his chest into ice. He had forgotten the infidelity clause. He had not written it. He had never read that part closely because it hadn't applied to him back then in love in his 20s. The idea of cheating on Elena had been unthinkable. Her attorney at the time had inserted a clause standard-seeming boilerplate that in the event either party committed adultery, the prenuptial protections for the offending party would be void, and marital assets would be subject to full and equitable division under the trust structure governing the parties' commingled holdings. He read that phrase 3 times. Trust structure governing the parties' commingled holdings. What trust? He said out loud. What commingled holdings? There's no... And then, because Mark Sterling was not a stupid man, only an arrogant one, and because arrogance is just intelligence that has stopped paying attention, he began slowly, horribly, to understand that there were rooms in his own life he had never opened. That the woman he'd dismissed as background noise had been the entire time standing at a control panel he didn't even know existed. He arrived home to an apartment that was still full of furniture but empty of Elena. Her closet was open and it was bare. Her books were gone from the shelves. The photograph of the 2 of them from their honeymoon, the one that had sat on the entry table for 12 years, was gone, and in its place was a single manila envelope with his name written on it in her handwriting. He opened it standing up in the doorway, still in his coat. Inside was a letter. It was 1 page, it was handwritten, and it was in its way the most devastating document he would receive that entire day. More devastating than the petition, more devastating than the SEC filings that were still to come, because it did not threaten him, and it did not accuse him, and it did not anywhere contain a single word of anger. Mark, it began, by the time you read this, you'll have talked to your lawyers and you'll know most of it. So I won't waste your time explaining what your lawyers can explain better. I'm writing this for one reason. I want you to understand that I did not do this because you hurt me. You did hurt me for a long time, more than you'll ever let yourself imagine. But that's not why. I stopped doing things because of you a long time ago. I did this because I watched you become a man I could not respect. And then I watched you become a man who could not be trusted with the things I built. And a woman does not hand her life's work to a man she cannot trust. That's all. It isn't revenge. Revenge is for people who still want something from you. I don't want anything from you, Mark. I just want you out of the house I built. Elena. He read it 4 times. Somewhere around the 3rd reading, he sat down on the floor of his own foyer in his $3,000 coat, and for the first time in more years than he could count, Mark Sterling had absolutely nothing to say. His phone rang. He answered it without looking, hoping a raw, childish hope that it was Elena. It was not. It was Robert Hantz, the chairman of Sterling Capital's board of directors, a man Mark had personally handpicked precisely because he'd believed Robert was loyal, malleable, and grateful. Mark, Robert said. His voice was strange, formal. I'm calling as a courtesy. We're convening a special session of the board on Thursday morning. A special session, Mark said. Regarding what? There was a pause. In that pause, Mark heard everything Robert wasn't saying. Regarding the ownership disclosure that was filed with the corporate secretary this afternoon, and regarding some questions that have been raised about the discretionary expense account, Mark, I think you should have your attorney present. The ownership disclosure, Mark repeated. Robert, what ownership disclosure? Another pause, and then Robert, who had known Mark for 15 years, who had golfed with him and drunk with him and taken his money and called him a friend, said the sentence that ended the last comfortable illusion Mark Sterling had left. The Marcello Heritage Trust filed formal notice of its controlling interest, 53% Mark. It's been the majority shareholder since the founding. We were all just informed this afternoon. A breath. Did you not know? Mark did not answer. He couldn't. The question hung in the air, did you not know? And the answer, the humiliating, world-ending answer, was no. He had not known. He had built his entire identity, his entire empire, his entire sense of himself as a self-made man on a foundation that belonged to someone else. To Elena, to the quiet woman he'd mocked that very morning with his mistress's lipstick on his collar. "Mark," Robert said, "you still there?" "I'm here," Mark said. His voice sounded even to himself like it was coming from very far away. "Thursday, I'll be there." "Bring your lawyer," Robert said again gently, the way you'd tell a man to bring a coat because it was going to be cold, and then he hung up. Mark sat on the floor for a long time. The light changed in the windows. The city went from afternoon to that copper-colored hour just before dusk, and he did not turn on any lights, and he did not move. He was doing something he had not done in 12 years. He was thinking about Elena. Not the invented Elena, the gray background wife. The real one. He was thinking about the way she read contracts at the breakfast table, and he'd assumed she was just keeping busy. He was thinking about the questions she used to ask him about the business. Precise technical questions that he'd found faintly annoying, that he'd brushed off, that he now realized had not been the idle curiosity of a bored wife, but the diligence of a majority owner monitoring her investment. He was thinking about how, whenever a deal went bad, whenever a partner turned hostile, whenever the walls seemed to be closing in some quiet intervention, would always mysteriously save him a bank that suddenly extended the loan, an investor who reversed a decision, a lawsuit that quietly went away. He had always credited his own luck, his own charm, his own genius. It had been her, all of it. For 12 years, the invisible hand that had steadied his empire every time it wobbled had been the hand of the woman he'd just called the woman I let live in it. He picked up his phone, and in a voice thick with something he refused to name, he called Elena one more time. It rang, and then to his shock, it was answered not by Elena, but by a woman with a crisp, cool, professional voice. "Mr. Sterling, this is Catherine Walsh. I represent your wife. Mrs. Sterling has asked me to handle all communication going forward, so I'll ask you to direct any future calls to my office." "I need to talk to her," Mark said. "Catherine, Miss Walsh, I just need 5 minutes, please. Whatever she thinks I did." "There's no thanks, Mr. Sterling," Catherine said, and there was not a trace of cruelty in her voice, which somehow made it worse. "We have the surveillance logs. We have the hotel records. We have 2 years of documentation, and it is, if I may say so professionally, some of the cleanest and most thorough evidence I've handled in 20 years of practice. Your wife did not build a case. She built an archive." A pause. "She anticipated you'd call. She asked me to give you a message." Mark's throat was dry. "What message?" "She said to tell you," Catherine said, "that she isn't angry, and that she's sorry it took her this long to stop being kind to a man who mistook her kindness for permission." A beat. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling." The line went dead. Mark stood up. His legs were unsteady. He went to the bar cart in the corner of the living room, the one Elena had picked out. He realized everything in this apartment had been picked out by Elena. The whole life had been furnished by her, while he took the credit for owning it, and he poured himself a drink with a hand that would not stop trembling. He was Mark Sterling. He was worth billions. He ran one of the most respected capital firms in New York. He had a jet, a driver, a penthouse, a corner office with his name on the door. And in the span of a single Tuesday, between one meeting and the next, between a kiss in a doorway and a phone call from a chairman, he had learned that every single thing he thought he owned had been on loan from a woman he had never once bothered to truly see. He drank. He looked out at the city. And somewhere underneath the shock and the fury and the disbelief, a small, honest voice, a voice he'd been silencing for 12 years, spoke up quietly and told him the truth. "You didn't lose because she was smarter than you," the voice said, "although she is. You lost because you decided a long time ago that she didn't matter, and she believed you, and then she made you right." His phone buzzed. A text. Not from Elena, from Jessica. He read it standing in the dark, and it was the final, small cruelty of a day made entirely of cruelties. "Mark, I've been thinking. With everything going on, I think it's best if we cool things off for a while. I have my own career to think about. I hope you understand. Take care of yourself. Jay." He read it twice. Then he laughed a short, ugly, broken sound, nothing like the confident laugh he'd laughed that morning against his office door. Cool things off. Take care of yourself. The woman he'd blown up his marriage for, the woman he'd chosen over Elena. The woman whose lipstick was still absurdly on his collar had lasted exactly as long as his fortune had looked secure. The moment the ground shifted, she'd stepped off him like a passenger stepping off a sinking boat, without so much as looking back. He set the phone down. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. A man in an expensive coat alone in a beautiful apartment that was not his, holding a drink he did not want. And Mark Sterling, for the first time in his adult life, was afraid. Not of losing money. Money he understood. Money he could rebuild. He was afraid of something much larger and much colder, the thing that had been standing behind the money the whole time, and that he had failed catastrophically to notice. He was afraid of the truth. And the truth was that Elena had not left him. Elena had removed him. There was a difference, and he was only now far too late beginning to understand it. Leaving was emotional. Leaving was messy. Leaving left a door cracked open. What Elena had done was structural, clean, and complete. She had not slammed a door. She had quietly, over 2 patient years, dismantled the entire house around him brick by brick, and then handed him the last brick with a note that said, "Essentially, I'm sorry it took me this long." He thought about Thursday, the board meeting. He tried to imagine walking into that room facing Robert and the others and defending himself, but defending what the company wasn't his. The vote wasn't his. 53% belonged to the trust, and the trust belonged to Elena, and Elena had already decided. Whatever happened Thursday had already happened. He would simply be present for it. A man attending his own funeral expected to say a few words. And the expense account. The SEC. Catherine had mentioned surveillance logs, hotel records, 2 years of documentation, but there was something else in the way Robert had said questions about the discretionary expense account that told Mark this went beyond a divorce. He'd used that account for years. Personal things, Jessica things, things that if you laid them next to the company's financial disclosures, if you had a diligent patient, methodical person cross-reference them, the kind of person who read contracts at the breakfast table would look to a regulator a great deal like fraud. Elena, he understood now, had not just prepared to divorce him. She had prepared to survive being divorced by him. She had built in silence over years a structure so complete that every move he might make to fight back would only tighten the net. If he lied, the documents would catch him. If he raged, the recordings would hold him. If he ran, the trust would follow him. There was no countermove because there was no game. The game was over. It had been over for 2 years. He'd just been the only one still playing. He finished his drink. He did not pour another. He walked through the dark apartment past the empty shelves and the missing photographs and the bare closet, and he sat down in the chair by the window where Elena used to sit in the mornings, reading her contracts, asking her precise questions. Being he saw it now, he saw all of it. Now. The smartest, most patient, most quietly formidable person he had ever known, and the one person on earth he had decided did not deserve his attention. "You should have talked to me," he said out loud to the empty chair, to the woman who was no longer there and was never coming back. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. She had talked to him. For 12 years she had talked to him with her questions, with her patience, with her loyalty, with the eggs and the tie and the driver he'd sneered about that morning. She had been talking to him the entire time. He was simply the one who had stopped listening. His phone buzzed one last time before he finally turned it off. It was an email forwarded automatically from the company's IT department. Cold, automated, final. Per instruction from the Office of the Board effective, immediately your access credentials to all Sterling Capital Group Systems facilities and accounts have been suspended pending review. Please contact Human Resources with any questions. Suspended. Effective immediately. He was, as of that email, locked out of the building with his name on it, locked out of the office where he'd stood that very morning, king of a kingdom he didn't own, mocking a wife he didn't deserve, kissing a mistress who was already at that hour planning her exit. Mark Sterling set down his phone. He sat alone in the dark in a chair that used to be hers, in an apartment that used to be theirs, in a life that had, without his ever noticing, quietly stopped belonging to him. And in the silence, the vast, complete, ringing silence that Elena had left behind her like a signature, he finally understood. The thing she had understood 2 years ago, standing in her closet, holding a second phone that wasn't hers. Silence was never weakness. Silence had been the sound of her getting ready. And while he had been busy building an empire he thought was his, she had been building the quiet, patient, unstoppable machine that would take it all back. Not in a rage, not in a scene, not in a single dramatic blow, but slowly, carefully, completely, until the morning came when Mark Sterling would wake up and reach for a world that was no longer there, and find in its place nothing but the echo of a woman who had already won. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in her chair until the sky went from black to gray, and he watched the city wake up without him. And he understood, really, understood all the way down, that the man who'd walked into that office the morning before, so sure, so safe, so certain that his wife was nothing more than the woman he let live in his world, was already gone. That man had died sometime around 4 o'clock on the floor of his own foyer, holding a one-page letter that never once raised its voice. And whoever was left sitting in the dark in Elena's chair was going to have to learn how to be a much smaller man in a much smaller world, because everything else, the company, the fortune, the marriage, the mistress, the name, the certainty, all of it had already quietly, in a silence he'd mistaken for surrender, been taken back by the one person he'd been too arrogant to fear. Outside, the sun came up over Manhattan, gold and indifferent, and it shone down on a city where somewhere in an apartment, Mark would never find a woman in a gray coat was sleeping soundly for the first time in 2 years. Not because she'd gotten her revenge, but because she'd finally permanently set down a weight she'd been carrying alone for far too long. She had not left her husband. She had corrected a mistake, and she would never, not once, not for a single moment, look back. Thursday morning came whether Mark Sterling wanted it to or not, and it arrived with a cruelty all its own because the first thing he learned that day was that he could no longer get into his own building. He'd forgotten. He'd stood at the black glass doors of Sterling Capital Group at 7:40 in the morning, coffee in hand out of pure habit, and he'd pressed his badge to the reader the way he'd done 10,000 times, and the little light had blinked red instead of green. He pressed it again. Red. He looked up, and there was Marcus, the security guard who'd worked that lobby for 9 years, who'd called him Mr. Sterling every single morning, who'd once told Mark that his daughter had gotten into Cornell because of a recommendation letter Mark had written, and Marcus would not meet his eyes. "Marcus," Mark said, "the badge is glitching." "It's not glitching, sir." Marcus's voice was quiet, apologetic, and absolutely immovable. "I got instructions last night. I'm real sorry, Mr. Sterling. You're on the visitor list for the 10 o'clock, and I can walk you up when your lawyer gets here, but I can't let you in before that. I'm sorry." Mark stood there in the lobby of the company that bore his name, holding a badge that no longer worked, being told by a man whose daughter's future he'd helped secure that he was, as of that morning, a visitor. He wanted to argue. He opened his mouth to argue, and then he saw 2 analysts come through the doors behind him, saw their eyes catch on the scene, saw them recognize him, and then quickly, deliberately look away, and he understood that arguing would only make it a story. So he swallowed it. He said, "That's fine, Marcus." And he walked back out onto the sidewalk, and he stood there among the commuters and the coffee carts locked out, waiting for his own attorney to arrive, so a security guard could escort him up to a meeting where he would be removed from a company he'd never actually owned. His lawyer was a man named Daniel Reyes, sharp, expensive, and as of about 9 o'clock that morning, deeply nervous. He arrived at 9:15 and pulled Mark aside near the elevators, and the first thing he said was not hello. "Mark, I need you to listen to me before we go up there, and I need you to actually hear me, which I know is not your strong suit." Daniel's voice was low and fast. "I spent all of last night with the documents your wife's team filed, all of them. The trust structure, the shareholder disclosures, the prenup, the evidence log." He paused. "In 15 years of doing this, I have never seen anything this clean. There's no crack, there's no ambiguity, there's no clever argument I can make. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand you're telling me to give up," Mark said. "That's what I'm hearing." "I'm telling you the vote today is a formality," Daniel said. "The trust holds 53%. Elena controls the trust. She's already signed the written consent. By the time we walk into that room, you've already been removed. The meeting is theater. The only thing you can control today is how you behave in it." He gripped Mark's arm. "So behave, Mark. For God's sake, do not give them anything, because this is not just a divorce anymore. There are people upstairs who want to hand your name to the SEC on a plate, and every word you say in anger becomes a line in an indictment. You hear me?" Mark heard him. Some part of him even believed him. But there was another part, the loud part, the part that had built an empire on the refusal to accept limits. And that part was already in that elevator, cooking up the thing that would ultimately destroy what little he had left. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was full when they walked in at 10. Every director was there. Robert Hauntz sat at the head of the table where Mark had always sat, and the symbolism of that was not lost on anyone. Down the side of the table sat men Mark had chosen, men he had enriched, men who had called him a genius at his own birthday parties, and they looked at him now the way you look at a man carrying a contagious disease, careful, distant, already grieving the loss of him, and already relieved. "Mark," Robert said, "thank you for coming. Please sit." "I'll stand," Mark said. "Suit yourself." Robert folded his hands. "I'm going to keep this brief, because I think we all understand why we're here, and dragging it out serves no one." He glanced down at a document. Late Tuesday, the corporate secretary received formal notice from the Marcello Heritage Trust asserting its controlling interest in Sterling Capital Group, 53%. That interest, we've now confirmed with outside counsel, has existed since the founding of this company and was fully disclosed in the original incorporation documents, which, and I'll be frank, Mark, none of us ever read carefully because you told us not to worry about them. A few of the directors shifted in their seats. It was Mark realized the first crack in their smugness, the recognition that they too had missed it, that Elena had fooled all of them. "The trust," Robert went on, "has exercised its right to call this session and has submitted written consent for a shareholder action. That action removes you as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately and appoints David Vance as interim CEO." He looked up. "I'm sorry, Mark, but this is done. It was done before you walked in the door." David Vance. Mark's eyes went to the far end of the table to a lean, gray-haired man who had been the company's chief operating officer for 6 years, a man Mark had personally promoted, a man Mark had trusted, a man who was now apparently going to sit in his chair. David met his gaze and had the decency at least to look uncomfortable, but he didn't look away, and he didn't say a word in protest. And that told Mark everything he needed to know about how quickly loyalty evaporates when the person it was loyal to stops holding the cards. "You," Mark said to David very quietly, "you knew about this." "I found out Tuesday afternoon, Mark," David said. "Same as everyone." "That's a lie." "It's not," David said, and there was something almost gentle in it, which was worse than if he'd been cruel. "I know you need it to be a conspiracy, Mark. I know you need someone in this room to have betrayed you because that's easier than the truth. But nobody in this room did this to you." He paused. "You did this to you. 2 years ago, in a hotel room." The words landed like the slap, and for a moment Mark had no answer, because there was no answer, and everyone in the room knew there was no answer, and the silence stretched out long and humiliating, until Daniel, his lawyer, put a hand on his arm and murmured, "Mark, not here, not now." But Mark shook the hand off, because the loud part had won, because a lifetime of never accepting a limit had built inside him a reflex that could not be overridden even by his own attorney, begging him in real time. And that reflex now opened his mouth and set loose the sentence that would take a bad situation and make it catastrophic. "You want to talk about clean?" Mark said, his voice rising, addressing the whole room now, the directors, Robert, David, all of them. "You think Elena's so clean? You think that trust is so airtight? Let me tell you something about my wife. Let me tell you where that money actually came from." He was pointing now, jabbing his finger at the air. "You people are about to hand this company to a woman whose family money has questions attached to it that none of you have bothered to ask. The Marcello Heritage Trust. You know what that is. You've looked into it because I have, and I'm telling you, there are things in the history of that money that this board does not want to be standing next to when the lights come on. It was a bluff. It was more than a bluff, a lie, and worse than a lie, it was a stupid lie, because Mark did not actually know a single thing about the Marcello Heritage Trust's history. He'd never bothered to learn, and he was inventing shadows on the spot, hoping to frighten the room into hesitation. And for one moment, It almost worked. He saw a few of the directors glance at each other. He saw a flicker of doubt. And then the door of the boardroom opened, and Catherine Walsh walked in. She had not been invited. Or rather, she had been invited by the only person whose invitation mattered the majority owner. And she walked in as calmly as if she owned the building, which through her client she effectively did. She set a slim folder on the table. She did not sit down. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "I heard my client's family trust described just now as having questions attached to it. As the trust's legal representative, I'd like to respond to that on the record, since I understand these proceedings are being minuted." She opened the folder. The Marcello Heritage Trust has been independently audited every year for 31 consecutive years by 3 different firms. Its complete records were voluntarily submitted to the corporate secretary of this company on Tuesday. Its funds were fully and legally sourced from a shipping and real estate fortune 4 generations old, every dollar of which is documented. She slid a single page down the table toward Robert. "That's the summary letter from the current auditors dated yesterday confirming a clean opinion. Mr. Sterling is welcome to allege whatever he likes, but he should know that everything he alleges is being recorded, and that knowingly making false statements about a shareholder's assets in a proceeding like this one in an attempt to interfere with a lawful corporate action is itself a serious matter." She closed the folder. "I'd advise him to be very careful about what he says next. The room was silent. Mark stood there with his lie hanging in the air, fully exposed, having just been caught fabricating an accusation in front of the entire board, and he watched the last flicker of doubt in the directors' faces die and turn into something much colder. Contempt. Not for Elena, for him. He had walked in as a fallen king, and in the space of 90 seconds, he had demoted himself to something smaller and uglier, a desperate man throwing invented dirt at the wife who'd caught him and missing. Daniel had his head in his hand. "I think," Robert said carefully, "we should proceed to the vote." They proceeded to the vote. It took 90 seconds. It was as Daniel had promised a formality. The written consent of the trust had already decided it. But they took the vote anyway, one by one, going around the table, and every director Mark had chosen, every man he had made rich, said the same word. Aye, to remove him. Aye, aye, aye. Around the whole table, the sound of his own hand-picked loyalists voting him out of his own life, and Mark stood there and listened to each one. And by the 5th eye, he had stopped hearing them as words, and started hearing them as something else, a sound like a clock, like nails, like the ticking down of the last seconds of the man he used to be. "The motion carries," Robert said. "Mark, I'm going to ask you to surrender any company property you have with you, and David will walk you through the transition of any personal effects still in your office. I'm sorry it came to this." "No, you're not," Mark said, but he said it quietly now. The fight had gone out of his voice, if not out of his heart. "You're not sorry, not one of you." He looked around the table. "You're relieved. You've been waiting to do this for years, and she gave you the excuse, and now you get to pretend you did it because it was the right thing." He almost laughed. "You want to know the funny part? A week ago, every one of you would have taken a bullet for me. And the only thing that changed is the math. 53%. That's all it took. That's all any of you ever were." He set his dead badge on the table. "Loyal to the 53%. I just didn't know who had it." He walked out. Daniel followed him, murmuring urgent things about damage control and staying quiet and not talking to anyone, and Mark heard maybe half of it. Because in the elevator down in the mirror-polished doors, he caught his own reflection again, the way he had the night before, and he saw a man who had just been fired from his own company by his own board on the instructions of his own wife, and who had, in his last act as its leader, been publicly caught lying about her. That was the image the whole industry would have of him by tomorrow. That was the story. Mark Sterling, who cheated on the woman who owned him and then lied about her assets in the boardroom and got caught by her lawyer in front of everyone. That was who he was now, not a titan, a cautionary tale. By 11:30 that morning, the first article was already online. It went up on a financial news site that Mark had in better days courted and flattered and leaked to. The headline did not use the word affair. It didn't have to. It said, Sterling Capital ousts founder Sterling as hidden ownership structure comes to light. And the body of the article laid out in clean, devastating detail the thing Mark had spent 12 years not knowing, that the company he'd built his identity on had been majority owned from day one by a family trust controlled by his wife. The reporter had gotten the ownership percentages exactly right. The reporter had gotten the timeline exactly right. And the reporter in the last paragraph had added a line that made Mark's blood run cold because it meant someone was talking someone on the inside. Sources close to the company indicate the ownership disclosure was accompanied by internal questions regarding a discretionary expense account controlled by Mr. Sterling, though the nature of those questions remains unclear. The nature of those questions. Mark read that line standing on the sidewalk outside a building he was no longer allowed to enter, and he felt the floor tilt under him again. Because the divorce he could survive, the firing he could survive, even the humiliation given enough time and enough money he could survive. But that phrase discretionary expense account was a door into a room he very much did not want anyone to open, and someone somewhere was reaching for the handle. He called Daniel. The article mentions the expense account. I saw it, Daniel said grimly. Mark, we need to talk about this in person, not on the phone. Come to my office. Just tell me how bad it is. There was a long pause. How much did you put through that account that wasn't business? Mark closed his eyes. Hotel rooms, jewelry for Jessica, the Hamptons house he'd rented for a woman who was not his wife. Dinners, flights a car he'd leased and parked in Jessica's name. Years of it. He'd never thought about it because it had never occurred to him that anyone would ever look. He was the CEO. He signed off on his own expenses. Who was going to question the man at the top? Elena. Elena was going to question the man at the top. Elena, who read contracts at the breakfast table, who asked precise technical questions he'd found annoying, who'd been the majority owner watching her investment the entire time. Elena had every single one of those expense reports, and she'd had them for 2 years, and she'd cross-referenced every one of them against the company's public disclosures with the patience of a woman who had nothing but time and a wound that never closed. A lot, Mark said finally. I put through a lot. Then we have a serious problem, Daniel said, because commingling personal expenses through a discretionary corporate account isn't just embarrassing, Mark. Depending on how it was reported and how it was disclosed to shareholders and to the IRS, it can be fraud. And if the trust hands that documentation to the SEC, which based on that article they may already be doing, you're not looking at a scandal anymore. You're looking at an investigation, possibly worse. Mark did not go to Daniel's office. He should have. If he had, the next 24 hours might have gone differently. But Mark Sterling, cornered, wounded, and stripped of everything that had ever made him feel powerful, did what wounded, cornered men do. He decided to fight, not smart, just hard. And he decided in the worst decision of a week, made entirely of worst decisions, that the way to fight was to control the story before Elena could. He knew a journalist, a woman named Carol Denning, who wrote for a major paper, who'd interviewed him twice in the good years, who he believed because he believed everyone was as transactional as he was could be steered. And Mark's plan, hatched on a sidewalk in a state of barely controlled panic, was to give Carol his version first, to frame it as a bitter, vindictive wife weaponizing a divorce using SEC threats, to strong-arm a settlement destroying a good company out of personal revenge. To get ahead of the story, to make Elena the villain before she could finish making him one. It was in every possible way a catastrophe. He called Carol at 1 o'clock. He was warm. He was confident he did the old Mark Sterling charm, and he told her he had a story for her, an exclusive, the real story behind the Sterling Capital headlines. And Carol, who was a good reporter, listened and asked a few questions and said she'd love to meet, and hung up. And then Carol Denning did what any good reporter does when a man who's just been publicly fired offers to hand her dirt on the wife who fired him. She called the wife's lawyer to get the other side. She called Catherine Walsh. And Catherine Walsh, who missed nothing, who had anticipated Mark's every move for 2 years, listened to Carol explain that Mark Sterling had reached out with an exclusive about his wife. And Catherine said very calmly, I see. Ms. Denning, before you meet with him, there's something you should be aware of purely for your own protection. There is an active regulatory review underway involving Mr. Sterling. I can't discuss its details. But I'd strongly encourage you to have your paper's legal department present for any conversation with him, and to be very cautious about repeating any factual claims he makes about the trust or the company, because we have documentation contradicting those claims, and anyone who publishes them may find themselves party to a defamation matter. A pause. I'm telling you this as a courtesy. I'd hate for a respected journalist to get pulled into something that's about to become a legal proceeding. Hamam. That was all it took. Carol Denning was not going to touch Mark Sterling with a 10-foot pole after that call. But it got worse because Catherine, being Elena's instrument, then documented the entire interaction, Mark's outreach, his attempt to leak information about an active regulatory matter, his effort to publicly discredit a witness and shareholder in the middle of a pending investigation, and she added it to the file. And that single act, Mark's clumsy attempt to control the story, transformed the SEC's interest from a review into something with teeth. Because now it wasn't just misreported expenses. Now there was a pattern, a man under investigation actively attempting to leak, to intimidate, to interfere. Now there was a word that regulators take very, very seriously: obstruction. Mark learned this at 4 o'clock when Daniel called him back, and Daniel's voice had changed. It wasn't nervous anymore, it was scared. "Mark, what did you do? What are you talking about? Did you call a reporter today? Did you call a journalist and try to give them information about the trust and the expense account?" Mark's stomach dropped. "How do you—" "Because I just got a call from Catherine Walsh," Daniel said, informing me as a professional courtesy that her client's outreach to a member of the press regarding a pending regulatory matter has been documented and forwarded to counsel, and that any further contact by you with witnesses, journalists, or third parties regarding this matter may be treated as interference. Daniel's voice was shaking with controlled fury. "Do you understand what you did? I told you. I told you this morning. Not 12 hours ago. Do not talk to anyone. And the first thing you did was try to leak to a reporter about an active SEC matter. Mark, you didn't get ahead of the story. You handed them obstruction. You took a fraud question and you turned it into an obstruction case with your own hands in an afternoon. Mark sat down on a bench in a small park phone pressed to his ear, and for the first time all day, for the first time since the manila envelope had landed on his desk on Tuesday, he felt not anger, not disbelief, but pure cold fear. The kind that has no floor, the kind that keeps falling. "What do I do?" he said. His voice was small. "You stop," Daniel said. "You stop everything. You stop calling reporters. You stop calling Elena. You stop calling the board. You stop trying to fix this, because every single thing you touch, you make worse. I have been doing this for 15 years. Mark and I have never seen a client sabotage himself this efficiently. You are not fighting your wife anymore. Do you get that? You're not fighting Elena. She's done. She won on Tuesday. What you're fighting now is the machinery you set in motion by refusing to lose gracefully. And that machinery does not care about you, and it cannot be charmed, and it will grind you down to nothing if you keep feeding it." A breath. "So stop feeding it. Go home. Say nothing. Let me try to save what's left." Mark went home, to the empty penthouse, to the bare closet and the missing photographs and the chair by the window that used to be Elena's. And he sat in that chair, and he did not call anyone, and for a long time he simply stared at the wall and tried to understand how a man could lose everything he had in the space of 3 days. But here is the thing about Mark Sterling, the thing that had made him rich, and the thing that was now destroying him. He could not constitutionally sit still and lose. Daniel had told him to stop. Every rational cell in his body knew Daniel was right. And still, around 7 that evening, the loud part woke up again, and it whispered a new idea, a worse idea, an idea born of the specific arrogance of a man who had always found a loophole. The trust. Everything came down to the trust. The trust held 53%. The trust controlled the company. The trust voided his prenup. Every road led back to the Marcello Heritage Trust. And Mark thought, what if the trust could be challenged? Not with the lie he'd blurted in the boardroom, the amateur bluff Catherine had demolished in 90 seconds. A real challenge. What if there was something in the structure of the trust itself, in how Elena had held it, in how she'd used it to capitalize the company without disclosing it to him, that could be attacked? What if he could argue that by concealing her control from her own husband and business partner for 12 years, Elena had committed some kind of fraud of her own? It was a drowning man's idea. It was reaching for a rope that was actually a snake. But Mark, who had never in his life met a fight he was willing to walk away from, picked up his phone and, ignoring everything Daniel had said, called a different lawyer. A litigator, a shark he'd used once in a hostile takeover, a man named Gerald Voss, who had no scruples and no fear, and crucially no knowledge yet of how completely airtight Elena's structure was. "Gerald," Mark said, "it's Mark Sterling. I need to hire you, and I need to hire you tonight, and I need you to find me a way to challenge a trust." He spent an hour on the phone with Gerald Voss laying out the situation, and Gerald listened, and Gerald got excited because Gerald was the kind of lawyer who got excited by other people's disasters. And Gerald said, there might be something here, non-disclosure to a spouse who's also a business partner, concealment of a controlling interest. If we can show she deliberately hid this from you to manipulate the company's governance, we might have a claim for fraudulent concealment. It's a long shot, but it's a shot. And for the first time in 3 days, Mark felt a flicker of the old fire. A path. A move. A way to fight back. He should have known better. Because Elena had thought of this too. Elena had thought of everything. At 9 that night, while Mark and Gerald were building their long-shot theory, Mark's phone buzzed with an email. It was from Catherine Walsh. It contained no threat and no argument. It contained a single attached document and a single line of text. "For your and your new counsel's review, K. Walsh." Mark's blood went cold at your new counsel. He'd hired Gerald 90 minutes ago. How did she know? How did she already know? But he opened the attachment and he read it, and the fire in his chest went out for good. It was a document. It was signed by Mark. It was dated 11 years earlier, 11 years from the second year of their marriage. It was a disclosure and acknowledgement, a formal legal instrument in which Mark Sterling acknowledged and consented to the Marcello Heritage Trust's investment in and controlling interest in Sterling Capital Group, waived any claim of non-disclosure, and agreed that the trust's participation had been fully and fairly disclosed to him. His signature was at the bottom. It was unmistakably his signature. It was witnessed. It was notarized. He stared at it. He had no memory of signing it. None. And then slowly, horribly, a memory did surface, a stack of documents Elena had brought him one evening 11 years ago, early in the marriage. "Just some housekeeping on the corporate structure, sweetheart. The accountants need your signature." And he'd been busy, he'd been distracted, he'd been on the phone, and he'd signed them without reading a word. The way he'd signed everything Elena put in front of him for 12 years. Because why would he read them? She was just his wife. She was just handling the housekeeping. She had not been handling the housekeeping. She had been 11 years ago calmly and quietly closing the one door he might someday try to escape through. She had known 11 years ago, before the affair, before any of it, before there was even a reason that a man like Mark might someday, if cornered, try to claim she'd hidden the trust from him. And so she had gotten him to sign in his own hand a legal acknowledgement that she hadn't. She had defeated a legal strategy 11 years before he thought of it. Mark set the phone down on his knee. His hand was shaking so hard the screen blurred. "She knew," he said out loud in the empty apartment to no one. 11 years ago. "She knew I'd try this. She was already—" He couldn't finish, because the scale of it was too large to hold in his mind. It wasn't that Elena had planned her divorce 2 years ago when she found the second phone. It was that Elena had been quietly protecting herself against him from the very beginning of their marriage, in ways he'd been too arrogant to notice. Laying down defensive lines a decade before there was an enemy, because some part of her, some clear-eyed part he'd never bothered to know, had understood what kind of man he might become long before he became it. His phone rang in his hand. It was Gerald Voss, and Gerald's voice was flat now, all the excitement gone. "Mark, I just got an email from Catherine Walsh. She copied me on a document." "I know," Mark said. "I got it too." "Then you understand that there's no case," Gerald said. "There's nothing here, Mark. You signed a full waiver 11 years ago. Notarized, witnessed. Your fraudulent concealment theory is dead on arrival. I'd be embarrassed to file it. And honestly," a pause, "the fact that she produced that document within 2 hours of you hiring me tells me she's watching every move you make, and she's 3 steps ahead of every one of them. Whatever you're paying attention to, she's already handled it. I'm going to be straight with you because I don't think anyone else has been brutal enough. You cannot win this, not any part of it. The only thing you can do now is stop losing worse." He hung up, and Mark Sterling sat alone in the dark for the second night in a row, holding a phone full of documents that all said the same thing in different words. "It's over. It's over. It was over before you knew it started." At 10 o'clock, his phone buzzed one final time. Not a call, a news alert. The kind he'd set up years ago to track mentions of his company. And this one made him physically flinch because the headline said, "SEC confirms formal investigation into Sterling Capital expense reporting. Former CEO's conduct under review." Formal investigation, not review. Investigation. And former CEO's conduct under review, that was him. That was his name in a national financial publication, attached to the two ugliest words a man in his position could imagine. And below the headline, the article noted in a single devastating sentence that the investigation had expanded in scope following reports of attempted contact with members of the press regarding the matter. His leak. His clumsy, arrogant, panicked leak. The thing Daniel had begged him not to do was now a matter of public record, quoted in the press, cited as the reason the whole thing had gotten worse. Every move he'd made had strengthened the case against him. Every single one. The boardroom lie caught by Catherine. The press leak documented and turned into obstruction. The trust challenge defeated by a document he'd signed 11 years earlier. He had not landed one blow. Not one. He'd swung and swung and swung, and every swing had put him deeper into the hole because he was not fighting a person he could outmaneuver. He was fighting the patient, complete, perfect architecture of a woman who had spent over a decade quietly building the exact machine that would catch him no matter which way he ran. He thought about Elena. He kept thinking about Elena. Not with anger anymore. The anger was burning off, and what was underneath it was something much worse, something like awe and grief braided together into a single, unbearable feeling. He thought about all the years he'd looked at her across the breakfast table and seen nothing, seen a quiet woman, seen background noise, seen a wife who folded his shirts and made his eggs, and asked her precise, annoying questions, and he'd never once, not for a single morning in 12 years, wondered what she was actually thinking. What she was actually doing, who she actually was. And now he knew who she actually was, and the knowing was a kind of punishment more exact than anything the SEC could ever hand down, because Elena Sterling was the most formidable person he had ever encountered in his life, smarter than any rival he'd crushed, more patient than any competitor he'd outlasted, more disciplined than any partner he'd ever trusted. And she had been sitting across from him at breakfast for 12 years, and he'd been too busy admiring himself to see her. He hadn't just betrayed her with Jessica. He'd betrayed her every single day for 12 years with his indifference. The affair was just the part that had a name. He picked up his phone. He knew he shouldn't. Daniel had told him not to. Gerald had told him not to. Every rational voice had told him not to. But he opened his messages, and he found Elena's name, and he typed and deleted and typed again, and finally he sent 4 words. Not a plea, not a defense, not another lie, just 4 words, the truest 4 words he'd said in 12 years. "I never saw you." He didn't expect a reply. He didn't deserve one. He set the phone down, and he waited, and the minutes stretched out, and the city hummed on outside the windows, indifferent as ever. And he was sure, absolutely sure, that the message would go unanswered, that Elena had already moved so far beyond him that his words could no longer reach her, and that this silence, this final silence, would be the last thing he ever got from the woman he'd thrown away. But at 11:07, the phone lit up. One message. From Elena. And it was not from Catherine. It was not from a lawyer. It was from her, and Mark's heart slammed against his ribs as he read it, because it was in 11 words, the most complete summary of his entire failure that anyone could have written. "No," it said. "You didn't. That was always the whole problem, Mark." And then 30 seconds later, one more message, the last one she would ever send him. The one that closed the door so gently and so permanently that Mark understood reading it, that there had never been a moment, not on Tuesday, and not for years before Tuesday, when he'd had any chance at all. "I stopped waiting for you to see me a long time ago," it said. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just gone. Take care of yourself. Please don't write again." And she was gone. He knew it with total certainty. He could feel it the way you can feel a door close in a house, even if you don't hear it, the specific quality of a silence that has become permanent. He held the phone until the screen went dark, and then he held it in the dark, and the man who 3 days ago had stood in a glass office mocking his wife to his mistress, without lowering his voice, sat alone in a bare apartment at the top of the world he used to own, and understood finally, fully and far too late, exactly what he had done, and exactly what it had cost, and exactly how quietly and how completely and how long ago he had already lost everything that had ever actually mattered. "Please don't write again." Those 4 words sat in Mark Sterling's phone like a stone at the bottom of a well, and for the rest of that night he obeyed them, not out of respect, but because he had finally run out of moves. But obedience did not last. It never did with Mark. By Friday morning, the fear had curdled into something more dangerous, and a man who had lost everything decided he had nothing left to lose, which is the most dangerous thing a desperate man can decide. Because it is almost never true. There is always more to lose. Mark was about to learn exactly how much more. He woke at 6 on Friday in the chair by the window, still in yesterday's clothes, his neck aching, his mouth dry, and for one merciful second before memory returned, he was just a tired man in a chair. Then it all came back at once, the whole avalanche, and he sat forward with his head in his hands and did the math on his own life. Wife gone, company gone, mistress gone, access revoked, reputation on fire in every financial publication in the country. And now hovering over all of it, the letters that could turn ruin into prison, SEC. His phone had 41 missed messages. He scrolled through them with a numb thumb, reporters mostly, a few from board members who wanted to formally distance themselves and had done so through their assistants. One from his brother in Chicago, whom he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, that just said, "Saw the news? You okay?" And which Mark stared at for a long moment before closing without answering, because he did not know how to say no to a question that large. And then near the bottom one from a number he didn't recognize sent at 4 in the morning that made him go very still. It said, "Mr. Sterling, we've never met, but I worked at Sterling Capital for 6 years in the finance department, and I left 18 months ago. I saw the news. I think we should talk. There are things about how the company handled certain accounts that I don't think you know, and that I don't think Elena knows either. Call me. Thomas Reeves." Mark read it 4 times. Things about the accounts that Elena doesn't know either. For the first time in 3 days, a spark of something that was not despair moved in his chest. A crack. A possibility. If there was something Elena didn't know, something in the finances, some card she hadn't already played and preempted and turned against him, then maybe there was still a game. He called the number before he'd even finished having the thought. Thomas Reeves answered on the second ring. He sounded young, nervous, and like a man who had not slept. "Mr. Sterling." "You said there are things I don't know," Mark said, skipping every pleasantry. "Tell me." "Not on the phone," Thomas said. "Please. I could get in serious trouble for even calling you. But I've been sitting on something for a year and a half, and when I saw the SEC news, I couldn't just, can we meet somewhere quiet? This afternoon." They agreed to meet at 2 at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from anywhere either of them was known. And Mark spent the intervening hours in a state he hadn't felt since Tuesday morning, since before the manila envelope, a kind of hunger. Because Mark Sterling was at his core a fighter, and a fighter with a possibility is a different animal from a fighter with none. He showered, he shaved, he put on a clean suit. He looked for the first time in 3 days like a man instead of a wreck. And the whole time, a voice in the back of his head that sounded suspiciously like Daniel Reyes was saying quietly, insistently, "This is a mistake. This is another mistake. You cannot help yourself. You are walking into another one." He ignored it. He'd been ignoring wise voices his whole life. Why stop now? He got to the coffee shop at 1:50. Thomas Reeves was already there in the back, a thin man in his early 30s with anxious eyes and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking. Mark sat down across from him. "Talk," Mark said. Thomas glanced around, then leaned in. When I worked in finance, there was an account, a discretionary account. Everyone knew it was yours. Everyone knew what it was really for. He didn't say the word affair, but it hung there. That's not the secret. Everyone knew about that. The secret is what happened to the reporting on that account about 2 years ago. He swallowed. About 2 years ago, someone went into the historical records and reclassified things, cleaned them up, recoded a bunch of the personal expenses as legitimate business costs, made the whole account look clean, going back years. Mark frowned. Cleaned it up. Someone made it look better. That's what I thought too at first, Thomas said. But then I actually looked at it. And Mr. Sterling, they didn't clean it up to protect you. They cleaned it up so that later when someone pulled the original records and the amended records side by side, it would look like you had personally directed a cover-up, like you deliberately falsified the historical reporting to hide the expenses. The reclassification was done under your login credentials, your authorization codes. Every entry has your digital signature on it. He looked at Mark. But you didn't do it. I know you didn't, because I watched it happen from 3 desks away, and it wasn't you sitting at that terminal. The coffee shop seemed to go very quiet around Mark. Then who was it? Thomas hesitated, and in that hesitation Mark felt the whole world tilt one more time, because he already somewhere knew the answer before Thomas said it. It was done by someone with full administrative access to the financial systems, Thomas said quietly. Someone who could use anyone's credentials. Someone who spent about 3 weeks in the office late at night around that time going through the historical books. I saw her. I didn't think anything of it then because it was your wife, and nobody questions the owner's wife going through the books. We all assumed she had every right. Elena. 2 years ago, right after she found the second phone. She hadn't just started collecting evidence of the affair. She'd gone into the financial system using the access her ownership gave her, and she had methodically recoded 2 years of Mark's personal expenses to look like a deliberate cover-up, all under his own credentials, building not just a divorce case, but a fraud case, a criminal case, one that had Mark's own digital fingerprints on every falsified entry. Mark sat back. He felt sick. That's insane. That's illegal. She falsified records under my login to frame me. That's what it looks like to me, Thomas said. But here's the thing, Mr. Sterling, and this is why I called you instead of just staying quiet. He leaned in further, his voice dropping to almost nothing. I have the audit logs, the real ones, the system logs that show which physical terminal made those changes and when, and that they were made after hours from a workstation that your login was never used on during the day. Your credentials were used, but from her office. At times when building security records, which I also kept a copy of, show that you weren't even in the building. I can prove it wasn't you. I can prove someone used your identity to make those changes. I kept everything because I had a feeling 1.5 years ago that someday somebody was going to need it. And there it was. The rope. The real rope this time, not a snake. A former employee with documentary proof that the very fraud Mark was being investigated for had been manufactured by Elena using his stolen credentials while he was demonstrably not in the building. Evidence that could potentially blow the entire SEC case apart and turn Elena from untouchable victor into criminal defendant. Mark's hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. Why? He said. Why would you keep this? Why would you help me? You don't know me. You left the company. You owe me nothing. Thomas looked down at his untouched coffee. Because I've got a wife and a 2-year-old and a mortgage, Mr. Sterling, he said. And I've been carrying this thing around for 18 months terrified because I stumbled onto something that could get powerful people in a lot of trouble, and I didn't know what to do with it. And when I saw the SEC news, I realized if they pin this on you and it's a lie and I stay quiet, then I helped. I helped frame a man. I can't do that. My father raised me better than that. He met Mark's eyes. I don't like you, Mr. Sterling. Everything I ever heard about you says you're exactly the kind of man who deserves to lose everything. But you don't deserve to go to prison for a crime somebody else committed and hung on you. Nobody does. So, that's why. Mark stared at this nervous, decent, terrified young man across a cheap coffee shop table, and for a moment he could not speak because Thomas Reeves had just described with perfect accuracy the difference between what Mark deserved and what was true, and had chosen truth over his own comfort in a way that Mark Sterling in 51 years of life had never once done for anyone. "What do you want?" Mark said finally. "For the evidence, name it." And something changed in Thomas's face. A door closing. "See that?" he said quietly. "That's the thing. That's exactly the thing. You just did the thing everyone said you'd do. You heard a man tell you he was doing something because it was right, and the only thing your brain could produce was what's the price." He shook his head slowly. "I don't want anything, Mr. Sterling. I don't want your money. I have the evidence and I made copies, and if you'd asked me to help you cheat, I'd have walked out. But you didn't ask me to help you cheat. You asked me to help you not get framed. That's different, and I'll do it. But not for a payment. For the truth. Try to understand the difference. I know it's hard for you." Mark absorbed the rebuke, and to his own surprise, he did not fire back. He just nodded. "Okay," he said. "The truth. Then help me get the truth in front of the right people. What do I do?" "You take this to the SEC yourself," Thomas said. "Not to a reporter, not to your wife's lawyer, not to the press, to the actual investigators. You go to them with a lawyer and you say, 'I've been made aware that the historical records were altered without my knowledge here, is a witness, and here are the logs, and I want to cooperate fully with your investigation into who actually did this.' You stop being a suspect and you become a cooperating witness. That's the only play. And Mr. Sterling," he pushed a small envelope across the table. "These are copies. The originals are somewhere safe. I'll testify, but you have to do it the right way. If you try to use this to blackmail Elena or to leak it or to spin it, they'll see through it in a second, and you'll be right back where you are. Do it clean. For once in your life, do something clean." Mark took the envelope. His hand closed around it, and for the first time since Tuesday, he held something that could actually change the outcome. He looked at Thomas. "Why do I feel like you know my wife better than I do?" "I don't know your wife at all," Thomas said, standing, buttoning his jacket. "I just watched her work for 3 weeks late at night, and I'll tell you something. I've never in my life seen anyone that careful. Everything she did was surgical. So if I were you, I'd move fast, and I'd move quiet because a woman that careful doesn't leave loose ends. And I'm a loose end. Which means I've been on borrowed time for 18 months, and I'd like to stop being one." He put a few bills on the table. "Good luck, Mr. Sterling. I mean that. Not because I like you. Because a man shouldn't go down for something he didn't do." And he walked out, and Mark sat alone with the envelope, feeling for the first time in days like a man with a weapon. He called Daniel from the car. This time he told him everything: the meeting Thomas, the audit logs, the reclassified records, the theory that Elena had framed him. And Daniel was quiet for a long time. "Mark," Daniel said finally, "if this is real, if this employee is real and the logs are real, this is enormous. This doesn't just help you. This could unwind the entire criminal exposure. If the fraud you're accused of was actually manufactured by someone else using your credentials, you're not a defendant. You're a victim of identity misuse and fabrication of evidence." A pause. "But Mark, I have to say the thing you don't want to hear. This is your wife we're talking about. Elena. The woman who has at every single turn this week been 3 steps ahead of you. And now at the exact moment you're at your lowest, a mysterious former employee appears with a perfectly preserved treasure trove of evidence that exonerates you and incriminates her. Doesn't that strike you as too convenient?" Mark finished. "Yeah, it occurred to me. But Daniel, I looked at this kid's face. He wasn't acting. He turned down money. He got angry at me for offering it. If Elena sent him, she's a better director than any human being alive." "Or," Daniel said slowly, "he's real and honest and exactly what he appears to be, and that's precisely what makes him dangerous. Because, Mark, think it through. If Elena is as careful as everyone says, as careful as you now know she is, then she went into those financial records 2 years ago knowing they might someday be examined. And a woman that careful does not falsify records under her husband's login in a way that a mid-level finance employee 3 desks away can casually spot and document and preserve for 18 months. That's not careful. That's sloppy. And Elena is not sloppy. She's the least sloppy person either of us has ever encountered." He let that sit. So either she made one enormous, uncharacteristic mistake at the single most important moment of her entire 2-year plan, or the thing you're holding is not what it looks like. Mark's grip tightened on the envelope. Then what is it? I don't know yet, Daniel said. But before you take one step toward the SEC with this, before you build your entire defense on a stranger's envelope, I want to verify every single thing in it independently myself. The logs, the timestamps, the building security, this Thomas Reeves, all of it. Because if you walk into the SEC and present fabricated exculpatory evidence, Mark, if this is a trap, and you spring it yourself, you don't just fail to escape. You hand them the final nail. Presenting false evidence to federal investigators is its own crime, a serious one, and it's the one crime you have not yet committed this week. A grim pause. Let's not make it a clean sweep. Give me the weekend. Let me verify. Then we move. Auntie. It was good advice. It was, in fact, exactly the right advice, the wise voice that Mark had spent a lifetime ignoring. And for once, for one shining moment, Mark almost listened. He almost said yes. Daniel, take the weekend, verify everything, do it right. But then his phone buzzed with a news alert, and the headline said, SEC investigation into Sterling Capital widens. Sources say charges possible within days. And the word days went through Mark like ice water, and the fighter in him, the impatient, arrogant, self-destructive fighter who had never once in his life been able to wait, overrode everything. We don't have the weekend, Mark said. You read that, days. They're talking days. If I sit on this while you verify and they indict me Monday morning, the exoneration doesn't matter because the headline is already Sterling charged, and I'm finished verification or not. I have to get in front of them now this weekend before they file. I have to. Mark, I'm doing it, Daniel. With you or without you. I'd rather it be with you. There was a long silence on the line. Then Daniel exhaled the sound of a man watching a car roll toward a cliff with his client at the wheel. Then here's what we do, he said. We don't hand them the evidence. We're not that reckless. We call the investigators, we tell them a witness has come forward with information relevant to the question of who authored the disputed records, and we request a meeting for early next week. That buys us the weekend to verify while still getting us on record as cooperating before any charge. That's the move. That's the only responsible version of what you're demanding. Can you live with that? Mark could live with that. Barely. Fine. Make the call. Daniel made the call. And here is where the weekend turned, because Daniel, being thorough, being the professional Mark, had never appreciated, did not wait to start verifying. He started that afternoon. He ran Thomas Reeves, and by Saturday morning he called Mark with a voice Mark had never heard from him before, a voice that was careful. The way you're careful walking into a room where something has died. Mark, I need you to sit down. What is it? Thomas Reeves is real, Daniel said. He worked at Sterling Capital Finance Department 6 years, left 18 months ago. All confirmed. That part's true. A pause. But Mark. 11 months ago, Thomas Reeves filed for personal bankruptcy. He's underwater. Mortgage in default, the 2-year-old, all of it exactly like he told you, except worse. He is not a man with savings. He is a man drowning. Another pause longer. And 4 months ago, a payment of $200,000 was made into a trust account for the benefit of Thomas Reeves's family. Educational trust for the kids, structured, clean, legal. I only found it because I know where to look. And the entity that funded that trust, Mark, 3 shells deep. Daniel's voice was very quiet now. Traces back to the Marcello Heritage Trust. The envelope in Mark's hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She paid him, Mark whispered. Elena paid him. $200,000, 4 months ago. She set this up 4 months ago. It looks that way, Daniel said. It looks like Thomas Reeves was recruited and paid and coached and sent to you with an envelope full of evidence designed to look exactly like the thing a desperate, arrogant, cornered man would grab with both hands and run to the SEC. The evidence is fabricated, Mark. It has to be. It was built to be found by you. And if you had walked into that meeting on Monday and handed federal investigators a stack of falsified logs supplied by a paid witness, and they traced it, which they would have the same way I just did, then you wouldn't just be facing expense fraud anymore. You'd be facing fabrication of evidence, conspiracy, obstruction, the whole tower. She didn't just prepare for you to fight back. She built a specific custom trap, baited with the one thing your ego could never resist the chance to prove you were the real victim. And you walked straight into the mouth of it and thanked the man holding the door. Mark could not speak. He stood in the empty penthouse holding an envelope that was not a rope and not a snake, but something worse, a hook Elena had cast into the water 4 months ago and had known with the terrible confidence of a woman who understood him better than he understood himself that he would swallow. But that decency, Mark thought wildly. That speech. Thomas turning down the money, getting angry. I don't want your money. Do it clean for once in your life. Do something clean. It had been so real. It had reached something in Mark, some buried thing. It had almost made him want to be better. The speech, Mark said aloud. He turned down my money. He got angry when I offered him money. If Elena paid him, why would he refuse? Because that's the genius of it, Mark, Daniel said, and there was something almost like admiration in his exhausted voice, the same helpless awe Catherine had shown, the same look David Vance had worn. Think about it. If he'd taken your money, you'd have been suspicious. A witness who wants payment is a witness who can be bought, and a man like you who thinks everyone can be bought would have smelled it. So she coached him to refuse it. She had him deliver a little speech about honesty and doing what's right, because she knew, Mark, that the one thing that would disarm your suspicion completely was a man who appeared to want nothing. She weaponized your own cynicism against you. She knew that the only person you'd ever trust is someone who seems immune to the thing that drives you. She didn't just predict your greed, she predicted your distrust, and she built a key for that lock too, 4 months ago. A long breath. Mark, I've been doing this for 15 years. I have never ever seen anything like this woman. She's not fighting you. She's playing a game you can't even see the board of. Mark sat down, slowly. The envelope slid from his fingers onto the floor, and he did something he had not done since he was a child, something he would have found unthinkable a week ago. Something that would have been impossible for the man who'd stood in a glass office mocking his wife to his mistress 5 days earlier. He put his face in his hands, and he wept. Not for the company, not for the money, not even entirely for himself. He wept because he was at last standing fully inside the truth of what he had done and who he had married and how completely he had been outmatched at every level, and the truth was too big to hold and too heavy to carry, and there was nowhere left to put it. But out through his hands in the empty apartment his wife had furnished and his wife had left. When it passed, he was quiet for a long time. Daniel waited on the line, the good lawyer, the wise voice saying nothing, letting him have it. Daniel, Mark said finally, his voice raw. Why? Why go to all this trouble? She'd already won. Tuesday. She had the divorce, the company, the prenup, the whole thing airtight done. She didn't need any of this. She didn't need to build a trap 4 months ago. She'd already beaten me before I knew we were fighting. So why? Why set a hook for a man who was already on the floor? And Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that Mark would carry with him for the rest of his life, the thing that finally completely explained the woman he'd been too arrogant to see. I don't think the trap was to beat you, Mark, Daniel said slowly. I think you're right. She'd already done that. I think the trap was because she knew you, better than you know yourself. She knew that after she won, you wouldn't accept it. You'd fight. You'd claw. You'd hire sharks and chase loopholes and try to leak to reporters exactly like you did, and every desperate move you made would put more people in danger and drag things out for years and hurt everyone around you. A pause. So I think she built the trap not to catch you. I think she built it to end you, to give you one last irresistible door, knowing you'd run through it, knowing that on the other side of it was a wall so final that even you, even Mark Sterling, who never quits, would finally have to stop. She didn't set the hook to reel you in, Mark. She set it so that you'd hook yourself so completely, so undeniably, that you would finally understand there was no fight left to have. It wasn't a trap to win. It was a A brutal surgical mercy. She was trying to make you stop before you destroyed yourself and everyone else because you clearly couldn't stop on your own. Mark sat with that, in the silence of the empty penthouse, and he understood that Daniel was right because it fit. It fit the woman in the one-page letter who'd written, "I'm not angry anymore." It fit the woman whose lawyer had said she wants removal, not revenge, structural correction. It fit the woman who'd texted, "Please don't write again," with a gentleness that had somehow been more final than any scream. Elena had not been trying to hurt him. Elena had been trying, in the only language a man like Mark could understand, in the language of consequences and traps and airtight architecture, to make him stop. To save him in the end from the one enemy she couldn't defeat on his behalf, the only enemy that had ever truly beaten him himself. "What do I do now?" Mark said. It was perhaps the first genuinely humble question he had asked another human being in 30 years. "Now," Daniel said gently, "you finally do the thing she's been trying to get you to do all week. You stop. You take the envelope, and we quietly, carefully turn it over to the SEC ourselves, not as your defense, but as evidence that someone attempted to induce you to submit fabricated materials. That flips it. It shows you didn't take the bait well, that you almost took it, but caught yourself and did the right thing. It's the one move that helps you, and it happens to also be the only honest one. And then you cooperate fully on the real expense matter. You accept what's coming for what you actually did, which was bad enough, and you let the rest go. You let her go. You let the company go. You stop swinging." A pause. For the first time in your life, Mark, you lose on purpose because winning is the thing that's killing you. Can you do that? And Mark Sterling, sitting on the floor of the beautiful empty apartment at the top of a world that was no longer his, holding the phone against his ear with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, looked at the envelope on the floor, the hook, the mercy, the last door his wife had built for him, and understood that the whole week from the manila envelope on his desk to this one on his floor had been one long lesson that Elena had been patiently, painfully trying to teach him, and that he was only now at the very bottom of everything beginning to learn. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I can do that." And for the first time in 12 years, he meant it. "Yeah, I can do that." And he meant it, but meaning a thing and doing it are two different countries, and the distance between them, for a man like Mark Sterling, had always been the exact distance at which he got lost. That Saturday night, he lay awake in the empty penthouse and rehearsed surrender the way other men rehearse a fight. He would turn over the envelope. He would cooperate. He would lose on purpose. And by 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, he had almost talked himself into peace. Almost. Because at 3:15, his phone rang and the name on the screen was one he never expected to see again, and it detonated every ounce of hard-won calm he'd managed to build. Jessica Hartley. He stared at the phone through 4 rings, his heart doing something complicated and ugly. The woman he'd blown up his life for. The woman who'd texted cool things off 11 minutes after his fortune wobbled. The woman he had not heard one word from in 5 days. He almost didn't answer. Every Y cell in his body, the ones that sounded like Daniel, said don't. But the wound she'd left was still open, and open wounds are stupid, and on the 5th ring he answered, "Jessica." "Mark." Her voice was low, fast frightened. Not the smooth, amused Jessica of the office doorway. A different Jessica. "Mark, I'm sorry to call so late. I know I'm the last person I know how I left it. But I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you now because I think I did something terrible, and I think you're the only one who'll understand what it means." Mark sat up. "What did you do?" 3 days ago, a woman contacted me," Jessica said. "A lawyer. She said her name was Catherine Walsh. She said she represented Elena." A shaky breath. "And she was so calm, Mark, so reasonable. And she told me that as someone who'd been involved, I was probably going to be contacted by the SEC as a witness, and that it would go much easier for me if I cooperated proactively, if I just told them everything I knew about the expense account and the trips and the everything. She said if I helped, they'd make sure I was treated as a witness and not a target. And I was scared, Mark. I have my career, I have my name, and I panicked and I said yes. I gave them everything. 2 years of texts, photos, the hotel bookings you sent me, I handed it all over 3 days ago." Mark closed his eyes. Of course she had. Of course. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, Jessica. It doesn't matter. Most of that they already... That's not why I'm calling, Jessica cut in, and now her voice was really shaking. Mark, I'm calling because tonight, an hour ago, I went back through my own phone. Through the old messages, because I couldn't sleep and I wanted to understand how she knew so much. And Mark, I found something. 2 years ago, right around when everything with us really started getting serious, I got a message from a recruiter offering me a consulting contract with a firm I'd never heard of. Good money, flexible, and I took it, and it was easy work, barely any work at all, and the money came in every month like clockwork, and I never thought twice about it because I thought I'd earned it. A sob caught in her throat. Mark, I just looked up the firm. Tonight. It doesn't exist. Not really. It's a shell. And I traced the payments as far as I could, and they route through something called the Marcello Heritage Trust, Mark said. Silence on the line, then in a whisper. How did you know? Because I've been chasing that name for a week, Mark said, and a cold, terrible understanding was opening inside him wider and wider like a sinkhole. Jessica, listen to me very carefully. When did you get that recruiter message? Exactly. I told you about 2 years ago, right when... She stopped. Right when things with us started getting serious. No, Mark said slowly. His mouth had gone dry. Not right when things got serious. Think. Was it right after or right before? A long pause. He could hear her breathing. He could hear her doing the math, the same math he was doing, and he could hear the exact moment she arrived at the answer because she made a small sound, a wounded animal sound. Before, she whispered. It was before. The consulting offer came about 3 weeks before you and I, before anything really happened between us. I'd almost forgotten. We'd flirted, but it was nothing yet. And then I got this offer, and I felt so confident and successful, and I remember thinking that was part of why I finally let myself, why I stopped resisting when you... Oh my God. Her voice cracked completely. Mark, did Elena? Mark could not answer, because the sinkhole had opened all the way now, all the way to the bottom, and he was looking straight down into it. And what was at the bottom was so much worse than anything he had imagined in a week of nightmares. He had believed the story of his own downfall was this. He had an affair his wife found out, and over 2 years she quietly built a machine to destroy him. That was the story. That was already devastating. But it was wrong. It was wrong at the very root, and the correction rearranged everything. Elena had not found out about the affair and then acted. Elena had engineered the affair itself. 2 years ago, 3 weeks before anything happened between Mark and Jessica, Elena had already known her husband was the kind of man who would cheat if given the right opportunity. She hadn't waited to catch him. She had, with the same surgical patience she brought to everything, arranged the opportunity. She'd identified Jessica. She'd funded a fake consulting contract to make Jessica feel successful, confident, desirable, primed. She'd created the exact conditions in which a woman like Jessica and a man like Mark would fall into exactly the affair they fell into. And then she had simply stepped back and documented it every meeting, every hotel, every text, because she had known before it happened that it would happen. She hadn't discovered his infidelity. She had commissioned it. She had built the crime she needed him to commit, handed him the perfect temptation, and waited for the man she'd married to be exactly the man she'd correctly assessed him to be. Mark, Jessica's voice was tiny now. Mark, are you there? Say something. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm being paranoid, that it's a coincidence. You're not being paranoid, Mark said. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. There are no coincidences with Elena. There have never been any coincidences with Elena. I'm only understanding that now. Then what were we? Jessica whispered. What was any of it? If she set it up, if I was hired, then you and I, everything none of it was real. I was a piece on a board. For 2 years I thought I was. I thought it was passion. I thought it was this reckless, real thing, and it was... She couldn't finish. It was a scene in a play she wrote, Mark said quietly. We both were. She cast us Jessica, you and me both. She knew me well enough to know I'd take the bait, and she knew you well enough to know you'd be the bait I'd take, and we did exactly what she wrote. Every line. For 2 years. He let out a breath that shook. We thought we were getting away with something. We thought we were the ones being clever, being reckless, being alive right under her nose. And the whole time, she was directing us. We were never hiding from Elena, we were performing for her. The cruelty of it was almost too much to comprehend. Every stolen moment Mark had felt so proud of every time he'd mocked Elena to Jessica, and felt so daring, so free, so much smarter than his quiet wife, all of it had been observed, anticipated, orchestrated. His rebellion had been assigned to him. His secret had been issued to him. He had spent 2 years feeling like a wolf, and he had been a lab rat the entire time running a maze Elena had built, congratulating himself on his own cunning while she watched him take every turn she'd designed. "I have to go," Jessica said suddenly, her voice thick with panic and shame. "Mark, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For all of it. I don't even know what I'm sorry for anymore, whether I did something to you or whether we both got, I don't know. I have to go. I can't." And she hung up, and Mark was alone again in the dark with the largest truth of his life, and it was heavier than all the others combined. He did not sleep. He sat by the window until dawn, and somewhere in those gray hours, something in him finished breaking, and something else began quietly to form. Because a lesser man, the man he'd been on Tuesday, would have taken this discovery and turned it into rage. She entrapped me. She manufactured the affair. She's the real criminal here. And he would have grabbed at it the way he'd grabbed at Thomas Reeves's envelope, and he'd have run to a lawyer or a reporter screaming entrapment. But Mark had spent a week learning in the hardest possible way what happened when he grabbed at things Elena had left in his path. And so this time, for perhaps the first time in his life, he sat still with a thing instead of swinging at it. And he asked himself a question he had never once asked in 12 years of marriage: why? Why would she do that? Why would a woman go to such lengths not just to catch a cheating husband, but to arrange the cheating in the first place? And sitting there in the dawn, he finally understood the answer, and it broke him more completely than the loss of the company ever had. She'd needed a clean exit, not just from the marriage without destroying the company, without destroying the trust, without destroying the 4 generations of family wealth, and the hundreds of employees, and the whole structure she actually cared about. If she'd simply divorced him for being cold, for being arrogant, for being absent, that was messy, contestable. A war of narratives, years of litigation, a fight for the company that could crater its value and hurt everyone. But an ironclad documented infidelity clause divorce with the offending party caught red-handed. That was clean. That was surgical. That protected everything and everyone except Mark, who deserved no protection. Elena hadn't manufactured the affair out of cruelty. She'd manufactured it because Mark had left her no honest door out of a marriage he'd already abandoned in every way, but the legal one, and so she'd built one the only kind he'd respect, the only kind that would hold. A door made of his own choices. He hadn't been framed. That was the thing. That was the unbearable, redemptive, humbling thing. Everyone he'd wanted to blame Elena, Jessica, the board. Thomas Reeves, none of them had made him cheat. Elena had opened a door, but Mark Sterling had walked through it, every step, willingly, eagerly. Nobody had held a gun to his head in that hotel room 2 years ago. Nobody had forced him to kiss Jessica in his office doorway 5 days ago, while his wife's name lit up his phone. Elena had known he would, but knowing a man will jump is not the same as pushing him. She had simply, with terrible clarity, understood exactly who her husband was, and she had built her entire liberation on the certainty that he would be himself. And he had been. He had been exactly, precisely, reliably himself. At 7 that Sunday morning, Mark called Daniel. He told him everything: Jessica, the fake consulting contract, the timeline, the whole terrible architecture. And Daniel was silent for a very long time. "Mark," he finally said, "I want to be careful here because I can see where your head might go with this. So let me say it plainly. Even if every word of this is true, even if she engineered the whole thing, it changes nothing about your legal situation. You still committed the affair. The infidelity clause still triggered. The expense fraud is still real because you really did put personal costs through that account. She didn't fake that part. She just found it. And my wife tempted me is not a defense to anything in any court, moral or legal. If anything, if you raise it, you'll look like a man so incapable of accepting responsibility that he blames his own betrayal on his victim. Do you understand? This discovery is a gift for exactly one purpose: for you to finally understand what happened. It is worthless as a weapon and radioactive as an excuse. So the question I need you to answer, Mark, and I need you to answer it honestly, is, what are you going to do with it? And Mark, who 1 week ago would have already had Gerald Voss drafting an entrapment claim, who would have already been on the phone to a reporter, who would have taken this final revelation and hurled it like a grenade. Mark surprised himself and surprised Daniel, and most of all, surprised the ghost of the man he'd been. Nothing, Mark said. I'm going to do nothing with it. It's not a weapon. You're right. It was never a weapon. It was the answer to a question I should have asked 12 years ago. He was quiet for a moment. Daniel, I want to move forward exactly like we said. We turn over the Reeves envelope, we flag the fabrication attempt, we cooperate fully on the real expenses. I accept whatever's coming for what I actually did. And the Jessica thing, the affair engineering thing, it never leaves this phone call. Not because it would hurt me legally, because raising it would be one more way of pretending I'm not responsible for my own life, and I'm done pretending that. I think I've been pretending that since I was about 25, and it's cost me everything, and I'm done. There was a silence on the line that Mark had never heard from Daniel before. Then Daniel said quietly, "In 15 years, Mark, that's the first thing you've ever said to me that made me think you might actually be okay someday." A pause. All right, let's do it right. Monday morning, we go in, we cooperate, we tell the truth, all of it, the real truth, and we let the consequences be the consequences. You'll probably lose the appeal on some of the assets. You'll almost certainly face penalties on the expense reporting, maybe worse depending on what they find. But if you go in clean, cooperating, taking responsibility, and hand them evidence that you refused to participate in a fabrication when it was offered to you, Mark, that's the difference between a man who ends up ruined and a man who ends up ruined but free. And free is worth more than you ever understood when you had everything. They hung up. And Mark spent Sunday doing something he had never done in his adult life. He did nothing. He didn't scheme. He didn't call anyone. He didn't try to win. He sat in the apartment and he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost and what he'd done to lose it, and he did not run from a single ounce of it. It was the hardest day of his life. It was though he couldn't have said why. Also the first day in years he'd felt like an actual human being instead of a performance of one. Monday morning came. 10 o'clock. Mark and Daniel walked into the field office of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Mark Sterling did the thing his wife had spent 2 years and a manufactured affair and a custom-built trap trying to get him to do. He stopped fighting. He told the truth. He handed over the Reeves envelope and explained fully that someone had attempted to induce him to submit fabricated exculpatory evidence, and that he had chosen not to, and that he was turning it over so they could investigate the fabrication itself. He acknowledged the real expense violations without excuse. He cooperated on every question. He named nothing about Jessica, offered no entrapment theory, blamed no one. When the investigator asked him near the end whether he had anything else to add, any other party he wished to implicate, any mitigating circumstance he wanted on the record, Mark thought about Elena, about the consulting contract, the trap, the whole invisible architecture, and he looked at the man across the table and said simply, "No, everything that happened because of choices I made. I'd like that on the record. The choices were mine." Daniel beside him closed his eyes for a second, and it might have been relief, and it might have been something closer to pride. The cooperation mattered. It didn't erase what Mark had done, nothing could, and Mark had stopped wanting it to. But over the following weeks, as the investigation ground forward, the difference between the man who'd walked in Monday morning and the man who'd tried to leak to a reporter the week before became the difference that shaped everything. The fabrication evidence Mark voluntarily surrendered opened a whole separate inquiry into who had built the fake, who had paid Thomas Reeves, how the trap had been constructed. And here at last, Elena's perfect architecture met its one limit, because Mark's decision to turn the envelope over instead of using it was the single move she had not been certain he would make. She'd built the trap knowing he'd probably spring it. She'd accepted the small risk that he might, at the very bottom of everything, finally choose differently. And he had. It didn't destroy her. Elena was far too careful for that. The trail to the Reeves payment was buried 3 shells deep and would take investigators years to fully unwind if they ever did, and the fabrication had been constructed so that its authorship pointed nowhere provable. She had built even her one vulnerability to be survivable. But it meant something that Mark had chosen not to swing. It meant that in the very last move of the game, the man who had never once in his life declined to fight had declined. Not because he'd been beaten. He'd been beaten days earlier. He declined because he'd finally learned the thing Elena had been trying to teach him, with every airtight document and every closed door and every mercy disguised as a trap, that some things are not fights to be won. Some things are just the truth, and the only way through them is to stop swinging and let them be true. 3 weeks after that Monday, Mark received one final piece of mail. Not from the SEC, not from a lawyer. A plain envelope, handwritten address, no return name, but he knew the handwriting the instant he saw it, the same handwriting from the one-page letter that had ended his old life on the floor of his foyer. His hands were steady this time as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet, and on it, in Elena's clean, certain hand, were just a few lines. Mark, I heard what you did at the SEC, that you turned it over, that you took responsibility and named no one, including me, when you had every reason and every opportunity to do otherwise. Space. I want you to know that I noticed. I spent 12 years waiting to see that man, and I'd stopped believing he existed. Maybe he only shows up when everything else is gone. Maybe that's the only time any of us really shows up. I don't know. I'm not coming back. That door is closed, and it stays closed, and this is the last time you'll hear from me. But I wanted you to know that the last thing I saw you do was the first honest thing I ever watched you do, and it's the version of you I'm going to choose to remember. Not out of forgiveness exactly, out of accuracy. Take care of yourself, Mark. Truly. Elena. Mark read it standing by the window in the apartment that was no longer his, and when he finished, he didn't rage, and he didn't grab at it, and he didn't try to build a strategy around it. He just held it, and he read it once more, and then he folded it carefully and set it down, and he understood that this was the actual ending, not the boardroom, not the SEC, not the loss of the company or the money or the name. This. A woman who owed him nothing telling him that the one true thing he'd finally done had been seen. It was not victory. It was not even reconciliation. It was something quieter, and he was beginning to understand far more valuable. It was the truth plainly stated between two people who no longer had any reason to lie to each other. And for the first time since a manila envelope landed on his desk on a Tuesday morning, a lifetime ago, Mark Sterling felt something in his chest that was not fear, and was not anger, and was not the desperate need to win. It felt distantly unfamiliarly like the very beginning of peace. It felt distantly unfamiliarly like the very beginning of peace. But peace, Mark was about to learn, does not arrive all at once, and it does not arrive without one final reckoning, because the past does not close its accounts just because a man has decided to change. 3 days after Elena's last letter, the phone rang, and it was Daniel. And his voice carried a weight Mark had learned to recognize as the sound of another shoe about to drop. Mark, the SEC came back with their preliminary determination on the expense matter. I need you to come in person. Mark's stomach tightened, the old fear reflex, but it was quieter now, more manageable. How bad? Come in and we'll go through it, Daniel said. But Mark, it's real. This is the part where you find out what the truth actually costs. He went in. He sat across from Daniel, and Daniel laid it out plainly, the way Mark had finally learned to want things laid out. The good news first, because Mark had cooperated fully, because he'd voluntarily surrendered the fabrication attempt, because he'd taken responsibility instead of obstructing the SEC, was not going to pursue criminal charges. There would be no indictment, no trial, no prison. The cooperation had bought him the one thing that mattered most, his freedom. But freedom was not the same as escape. The expense violations were real, and they carried real consequences. There would be a substantial financial penalty in the millions a settlement he would pay out of what remained of his personal assets after the divorce. There would be a formal finding against him on the public record, permanent. and there would be a bar. Mark Sterling would be prohibited from serving as an officer or director of any public company for a period of years, possibly for life pending review. The man who had built an empire, or believed he had, would never sit in a boardroom again. Mark absorbed it, and Daniel watched him absorb it, braced for the old Mark, the Mark who would rage against the penalty, who would demand appeals, who would swing. But that Mark was gone. "Okay," Mark said quietly. "I'll pay it. I'll take the finding. I'll accept the bar." He looked at Daniel. "It's fair. That's the strange thing. A month ago, I'd have called it a persecution. But it's just fair. I did the things. These are the consequences of the things. That's how it's supposed to work." He almost smiled. "I spent my whole life making sure consequences happen to other people and not to me. Turns out when they finally catch up, they're not the end of the world. They're just the bill coming due." "There's one more thing," Daniel said, and now he hesitated, which was unlike him. "The investigation into the fabrication, the Reeves envelope, the fake evidence. They've been digging, and they hit the same wall I hit. The trail runs 3 shells deep, and then it goes cold. They can prove the evidence was fabricated. They can prove Reeves was paid, but they cannot prove who paid him or who directed it. The architecture is too clean. Whoever built it to never be provable." He looked at Mark carefully. "They asked me, Mark, officially, whether my client had any information about who might have constructed the fabrication and why, whether you could shed any light on the source." And there it was, the last door, the final temptation, the one move Mark had left that could actually reach Elena, because Mark knew. Mark knew about the Marcello Heritage Trust and the payment structure and the whole architecture. Mark knew Elena had built the trap. And if he told the investigators what he knew, if he pointed them at the trust, if he handed them the thread to pull, he couldn't be sure it would destroy her. She was too careful for that. But it would turn her airtight ending into a fight, a long, ugly, uncertain fight, and it would take the one thing she'd wanted more than anything, the clean exit, the structural correction, the walking away without ever looking back, and it would deny it to her. He could not beat Elena, but he could possibly take her peace the way she'd taken his empire. An eye for an eye, the last swing available to him. Daniel was watching him. "It's your call, Mark. I'm obligated to tell you that if you have information relevant to their inquiry, there are arguments for providing it. And I'm also going to tell you, as someone who's watched you this last month, that this is the real test. Not the SEC, not the money. This, right here, what you do with the one card you have left." Mark was quiet for a long time. He thought about Elena, not the invented Elena, the background wife, but the real one, the one he'd finally learned to see far too late. He thought about a woman who'd sat across from him at breakfast for 12 years, being brilliant, being patient, being unseen, while he mocked her to a mistress and congratulated himself on his own genius. He thought about the trap she'd built not to win, but to make him stop the mercy disguised as ruin. He thought about her last letter. "The last thing I saw you do was the first honest thing I ever watched you do." And he understood that this right now, this exact moment, was the test of whether that had been true or whether it had been just one more performance, a single honest act, followed by a return to form. "No," Mark said. "I don't have any information relevant to their inquiry." Daniel exhaled slowly. "You understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Mark said. "I'm letting her go, all the way. Not just the divorce, not just the company. I'm letting her have the thing she actually wanted, which was to walk away clean and never look back and never have to fight me again." He met Daniel's eyes. "She gave me my freedom, Daniel. Not on purpose, maybe. But when I turned over that envelope instead of using it, when I told the truth instead of obstructing, the reason I got to keep my freedom is that I finally did the thing she'd been trying to get me to do for 2 years. She taught me how to stop. And a man does not repay that lesson by using it to take away the peace of the person who taught it." He sat back. "I did enough to her. I did 12 years of damage she never let me see. This is the one thing I can give her back, her clean exit. She earned it. God knows I didn't earn anything, but she earned it. So no, I have no information. And I never will." And in that moment in a lawyer's office with nothing left to gain and everything already lost, Mark Sterling did the one genuinely selfless thing of his entire adult life. He let his enemy win completely and told no one, and asked for nothing in return. It was the smallest act, invisible, unrewarded, that no one would ever thank him for. Elena would never even know he'd done it, and that was exactly what made it the truest thing he'd ever done, because it was the first choice he'd ever made that wasn't a performance for someone watching. Daniel closed his folder. Then that's what I'll tell them. He stood and he extended his hand, and when Mark shook it, Daniel held on a moment longer than a handshake required. For what it's worth, Mark, and I've been doing this a long time, I've represented a lot of men in your position. Most of them never get here. Most of them die angry, appealing everything, blaming everyone, ruined and bitter, and certain it was done to them. You're the rare one. He let go. You got ruined and you came out the other side a person. That's not nothing. That might even be everything. Esqueo o abicato. The months that followed were an education in a kind of life Mark had never lived. He paid the penalty, and it took most of what remained. He signed the divorce settlement, and under the infidelity clause and the trust structure, he walked away with a fraction of what he'd once commanded, enough to live modestly, not enough to be Mark Sterling, titan of finance, ever again. He gave up the penthouse. He couldn't afford it, and he found when he finally left it that he wasn't sorry to go, because it had never really been his. It had been Elena's. All of it had always been Elena's. He moved into a small apartment across the river, a place with no view of anything in particular, and for the first time in 30 years, he lived in a home that his own name was actually on, small as it was, and there was something almost sweet in that. The world moved on the way the world does. Sterling Capital Group thrived under David Vance, which stung at first, and then gradually stopped stinging, because Mark came to understand that a company thriving without him was proof it had always been more than him, that the empire he'd taken sole credit for had been carried all along by people he'd never bothered to see, David and the board and 1,000 employees, and above all, Elena, whose steady hand had caught it every time it wobbled. He'd thought he was the sun the whole thing orbited. He'd been a passenger who'd wandered up to the cockpit and mistaken the view for control. He heard about Elena occasionally, the way you hear about a distant weather system. She never returned to public life. She never gave an interview about the man who'd tried to destroy her and destroyed only himself. She simply quietly continued being what she had always been, beneath the silence, a woman of enormous capability who had no interest whatsoever in being seen doing it. Catherine Walsh had said it months ago in the very beginning. She doesn't want revenge. She wants removal. Not emotional destruction, structural correction. And that was exactly what Elena took, and not 1 ounce more. She had removed Mark from the structure the way a surgeon removes a tumor, cleanly, completely, and without malice, because malice would have meant she still cared, and Elena had stopped caring a long time before Mark ever noticed there was anything to lose. That was the part that stayed with Mark the longest in the quiet years that followed. Not that Elena had beaten him. Anyone could have beaten him. He'd made himself easy to beat. What haunted him, and then slowly stopped haunting him and started teaching him, was that she'd never hated him. Hatred would have been a kind of connection. Hatred would have meant he still mattered to her. But Elena hadn't destroyed Mark out of hatred. She'd removed him out of accuracy because she'd assessed correctly that he was a man who could not be trusted with the things she valued, and a clear-eyed person does not hand her life's work to someone she cannot trust, no matter how much she once loved him. It wasn't emotional. It was just true. And the truth, Mark had finally learned, was the most powerful force in the world, more powerful than money, more powerful than charm, more powerful than all the performance he'd built his life on, because the truth was, the one thing that could not be leveraged, could not be spun, could not be charmed, and would eventually always arrive. He thought often about the morning it all began. That Tuesday, standing in the glass office mocking his wife to Jessica, without lowering his voice, so certain, so safe, so completely the master of a kingdom he did not own. He thought about how he'd silenced her call with his thumb. Elena can wait. She always waits. And he understood now with a clarity that had cost him everything to earn that she had not been waiting. She had never been waiting. That was the whole tragic misunderstanding of their 12 years together. He'd looked at her stillness and seen a woman waiting for him, dependent on him, orbiting him. And all along, her stillness had been the stillness of a person who had already finished, who had already decided, who was simply allowing the last formalities to play out. He'd mistaken the calm of a woman who'd already won for the patience of a woman who was still hoping. He'd mistaken an ending for a devotion. She had not lost her husband because she left. That was what he finally understood sitting alone in his small apartment on the far side of the river, in a life that was quieter and poorer, and in some strange way he could not have explained to the man he used to be more real than any life he'd ever lived. She had not lost him because she left. He had lost her years before she left, because she had simply quietly outgrown the man he'd chosen to become, and he'd been too busy admiring the man in the mirror to notice the woman across the table pulling further and further away, until the distance was so complete that when she finally moved, there was nothing left to break because everything had already broken so slowly he'd never heard a sound. And in the silence, that vast, patient, complete silence he'd once mistaken for weakness, she had won her freedom years before he even realized there was a war. There had never been a battle. There had never been a moment when he'd had a chance. By the time he saw the first envelope on his desk, the war had been over for 2 years, and he had lost it without ever once landing a blow, because you cannot fight an opponent you refuse to see. And he had refused to see Elena from the very first day of their marriage to the very last. Mark Sterling lived a long time after that. He never remarried. He never rebuilt the empire. The bar saw to that, and by the time it was lifted, he no longer wanted to. He found to his own quiet astonishment small work that suited him advising younger people occasionally on the mistakes he'd made, which he'd become oddly ruthlessly honest about. He'd sit across from some hungry young founder, some version of himself at 25, and he'd say, "The person in your life you think is background noise, the one who's always just there, quiet, reliable, taken for granted, pay attention to that person. Really look at them. Because the day you stop seeing someone is the day you start losing them, and you won't hear it happen, and by the time you notice it'll be finished." It was the only wisdom he had. It had cost him everything he'd ever owned. He gave it away for free to anyone who'd listen, because it was the one thing he had left that was actually his honestly earned, paid for in full. And late at night, sometimes in the small apartment with no view, Mark would take out the 2 letters, the one that had ended his old life on the floor of his foyer, and the one that had, in its quiet way, given him the beginning of a new one. He'd read them both. The first, the one that said, "I did this because I watched you become a man I could not respect." And the last, the one that said, "The last thing I saw you do was the first honest thing I ever watched you do." And between those 2 letters he understood was the entire distance a man could travel in a single lifetime from a person his wife could not respect to a person who had finally, once at the very bottom of everything, done something honest enough to be remembered for. It was not redemption. Mark had stopped believing in redemption. It was too clean a word for something so partial and so late. But it was correction. It was exactly as Elena had wanted from the very beginning. Not emotional destruction, but structural correction. And in the end, the structure she'd corrected most completely, the one thing her surgical patients had actually rebuilt, was not the company, and not the marriage, and not her own freedom. It was Mark himself. She had removed him from her life cleanly and completely, and in doing so, without ever intending to, she had removed from him the one thing that had been destroying him all along, the certainty that he was the center of everything, that he could not be touched, that the truth would never come for a man as clever as he was. She took his empire and gave him in exchange the only thing he'd ever actually needed, and the one thing he could never have bought the truth about himself. It was the most expensive gift ever given. He'd have refused it if she'd offered it, so she hadn't offered it. She'd simply patiently, in silence, arranged the world so that he had no choice but to finally receive it. Mark Sterling died an old man in a small room with very little to his name and a peace he'd never known when he had everything. And he understood at the end, the thing he'd spent his whole life too arrogant to learn, that Elena had never been the quiet background of his story. She had been the author of it. He'd thought he was the one writing his life, the one in control, the one who could not lose. But the quiet woman across the breakfast table had been holding the pen the entire time. And when she'd finally decided to end the chapter, she'd done it not with rage, not with revenge, not with a single raised voice, but with the calm, complete, unanswerable authority of a person who had seen the whole truth clearly years before anyone else even knew there was a truth to see. She had not screamed, she had not cried, she had not begged. She had simply prepared in silence until the silence itself became the loudest and most final word ever spoken between them. And in that silence, she had won not just the company, not just the divorce, not just her freedom, but the argument that had defined their entire marriage and the whole of Mark's arrogant life, that the person you refuse to see is not the one who is weak. She is the one who is watching. She is the one who is preparing. And she is the one who, in the end, when every loud man has finished shouting and every empire has crumbled and every performance has collapsed into the truth, it was always hiding, will be the last one standing quiet, unbroken, and already long ago gone.